Hello, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. My name is May Whiting, and I am the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible. Today, our webinar is going to cover next steps after submitting a FAFSA. So first, we would like to thank our sponsors, including our new sponsors, for supporting these professional development trainings. And then, of course, we would also like to thank our wonderful partners who collaborate with us on the Alabama Goes to College campaign. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times just to avoid any feedback during the presentation. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded so that we can upload it to our YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/Alabama Possible. Throughout today's webinar, you have an opportunity to submit questions, and you can do so through the Zoom chat feature. We'll be collecting those questions throughout the webinar and then hopefully answering them during our Q&A session towards the end. When you submit a question or a comment, just make sure that you select to everyone so that we can all see your question or comment, and that way we can reduce any duplicate questions. And then throughout today's webinar, we'll have some poll questions. That will be so that high school educators can receive professional development credit. So please respond to the poll questions both at the beginning of the webinar and all the way towards the end of the webinar to be eligible for PD. And just so you know, the way that we track professional development eligibility, first you have to attend the majority of the webinar. So it's important that you are logged into your own Zoom account so that when we pull the Zoom records, we see your name as an attendee. And then you must answer those poll questions to provide us feedback so that you can be eligible. So as y'all are supporting students and posting on social media, you can always tag us at AL Goes to College. We're on multiple platforms, which you see here. And anytime you're having these college and career going conversations, feel free to use the hashtags that you see down below, such as AL Goes to College, hashtag Cash for College, or anything like that. So there is still an opportunity to register for this year's Alabama Goes to College campaign. I'm sure most of you have already done that, and that's why you're here, but this is the link if your school has not yet registered for the campaign. And then, of course, many of you know that our campaign consists of 3 different components. Today, of course, we're going to be focusing on Cash for College, that first component, which really builds awareness around financial aid opportunities and then supports students with FAFSA completion. So here are today's learning objectives. By the end of the webinar, we hope you'll gain confidence with navigating the steps that students must take after submitting a FAFSA. And then we also hope that you understand how to provide support for students to be able to make informed financial decisions about their next steps after high school. So before we get started, I just want to do a few poll questions to get a better understanding about your experience with FAFSA next steps. So you should see 2 questions on your screen. And we want to understand whether or not you are including content about post-submission tasks when you're having FAFSA conversations with seniors. And then we also want to understand who you might be referring your students to so that they can get assistance with some of these post-submission tasks. Okay, so about 2/3 of y'all have answered, and the majority of you are saying you do have conversations with students about post-submission tasks, so that's great to hear. And then when students need assistance with those tasks, the majority of you are referring students to the financial aid office of the college that the student might be attending. So you'll hear that advice repeatedly throughout today's webinar. So I'm glad that is the case. Often that is who the student should be consulting with, the financial aid office of the college. They'll have the most relevant information for the student to do these post-submission tasks. So great, I'm going to end this poll now. And then before we dive in, I just want to give a quick update on how FAFSA completion is going for the class of 2023. So to see how our state compares to the rest of the nation in terms of FAFSA completion, we're going to look at the National College Attainment Network's FAFSA tracker. So that's what you see here on the screen. This is showing FAFSA data through February 17th. So here on the left side of the screen, you're seeing Alabama's year-over-year change is pretty similar to the national year-over-year change. So Alabama is currently seeing a 5.2% increase in FAFSA completion, while the nation is seeing a 5.8% increase in FAFSA completion. And then on the right of the screen, you can see that our state's completion rate is a little bit higher than the national completion rate. So awesome news, our state is seeing a 39.8% completion rate, while the nation is seeing a 39.4% completion rate. And that currently ranks us 20th in the nation for FAFSA completion. So I want to congratulate everyone, especially on the gains that have been made over the last month or so. So that was our state as a whole. And I just want to break this down a little bit more by looking at some specific populations. So here you're seeing that we have year-over-year increases for almost every single selected characteristic or demographic in our state. And we are seeing higher year-over-year increases in FAFSA completion at low-income schools where, financial aid has the potential for the biggest impact. So this is all really positive news. And again, just want to congratulate you on that. So we're going to jump into FAFSA next steps. So when a student presses submit, their FAFSA may not be accurate and it may not be complete. And because of this, many students will need to do some additional steps. So what are those next steps after submission? So we're going to go through each of these, but first they'll check the status of their application. They'll review their student aid report. They will make any corrections that are necessary, provide any verification information, then review their actual aid offers from their colleges, and then decide what aid to accept. So starting off with checking the status, the student should have reached a confirmation page after submitting the FAFSA. So you see a screenshot here. And after that, the student can then monitor the status of their application by logging into federal student aid with their account. I want to make a note here that this congratulations screen does not necessarily mean that the student has fully completed everything. So if you have students who are trying to prove that their FAFSA is complete and they print you off a page with this congratulations screen, that does not necessarily tell you that the student has completed their FAFSA. It merely tells you that the student has submitted their FAFSA. So just want to clarify that because that tends to come up quite a lot. Now, the confirmation page can provide aid estimates, but it's important to know that this is not a student's official financial aid offer. When we are thinking about how to check the status of the application, just know that it takes about 3 to 10 business days for the Department of Education to process a FAFSA. So it's about 3 to 5 days if the student submitted an online application, and then about 7 to 10 days if they submitted a paper application. And a student should regularly check the status of their application to confirm that it has actually been processed. So even after they've pressed the submit button, they should be regularly monitoring if their application's been processed. And that's because they might have skipped some steps, so they might need to go back and complete those. They might need to complete some follow-up tasks, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that could look like. And then some students, when they go to check the status, they'll see that the application says it's processing. And if it has been stuck in that processing status for an extended period, then this happens frequently. The way to resolve this is to call Federal Student Aid, have the number here 1-800-433-3243 to check why. Really, only Federal Student Aid is going to be able to answer the question for why a student's application is stuck in processing. But generally, we want to see a student's application move to the process status in about a 3 to 10 day time frame. So this is what it would look like if a student logged in with their FSA ID to check on their 2023-24 application. They want to see that little green icon there that says process successfully. Now, once the form has been processed, a record of the student's information is then sent to all of the colleges that the student listed on their FAFSA. And then the student will receive their aid offers directly from the schools where they are applying and then admitted. And so it's important that the student knows the aid offer does not come from Federal Student Aid. It comes from the actual schools where they're applying. And that's because their aid offer will take into account a school's very specific cost of attendance. So just let the student know that they'll be receiving that information from the college. Now, after we have checked the status of the application, the student should expect to receive a student aid report, or a SAR. So the student aid report summarizes the information that the student reported on their FAFSA form. And it has several different components, but it can include the expected family contribution, or the EFC, the estimated eligibility for federal student loans and federal Pell Grants, whether the student has been selected for federal verification, and then any issues that need to be resolved. And we'll see where each of these components fall on the student aid report. So like I showed you, when the student logs in, they'll be able to see whether their application has been processed. And then if they scroll down just below that, they'll see these different options. And the last option is the option to view the student aid report. So they'll click that, and then they'll see this page. So we see the processing results, and then we'll go through some of these tabs here on the left. So it's important that after the student has regularly checked to see if their applications have been processed, that they then regularly check to see if their student aid report's available. So they're going to check their email or mail for that. And the student aid report takes about 3 days to 3 weeks to receive, just depending on how the student submitted their application. And then, of course, it will also depend on whether the student included a valid email address. Now, when possible, students are encouraged to sign their FAFSA with their FSA ID. So they're signing their FAFSA electronically to expedite how quickly they receive their student aid report. So you might have seen guidance from us this morning in our newsletter, but we do not recommend students sign their FAFSA by mailing in a signature page unless that is absolutely necessary. So if that is the only option for the students, say their parents are not US citizens, or they do not have, the parents do not have a social security number and therefore have to sign the FAFSA by mailing a signature page, that is really the only reason that a student should be, that a family should be signing the FAFSA by mailing in a signature page. Ultimately, we want every student who's able to sign electronically to do so, so that they can quickly receive their student aid report. So once we have the student aid report, we want to check for a few things. We want to check for the expected family contribution. So on the electronic version of the SAR, that's going to be located in the processing results tab. And it's important to check for the EFC because if it's missing, that means that the FAFSA is incomplete. So if the app is incomplete, then the student aid report is going to tell the student what they need to do to resolve any issues, and we'll show you what tab that is located on. But essentially, you're going to go to the FAFSA data tab and see the section, what you must do now, to see any issues that need to be resolved. So here we can see on our processing results tab, we have an expected family contribution of 0. So that means that the FAFSA does have an EFC available to the student. And then in the FAFSA data tab, there will be a what you must do now section. So if we go to that tab, we see a few different bulleted items here. This says, be sure to review the items marked with a H to make any corrections if necessary. So it's prompting the student to check whether or not there are any corrections that need to be made, and it's highlighting those by showing this little blue H icon. So the student should flip through all of the tabs here to see if there are any follow-up tasks. Now, if the student finds a mistake when they're reviewing the SAR, then they'll need to correct or update their FAFSA. And it's important to know that when a student completes the FAFSA, most of the questions on the FAFSA want to know the student's situation as of the day the student signs the application. But then there are some items where the student will actually need to or be required to change the information that they originally reported. So we'll show you a few of those options. So if the student knows that they need to make corrections, say there was a mistake, say there was a change in their situation, which we'll talk very specifically about what those changes might be, then when they log in with their federal student aid ID, they'll scroll down and click the Make Corrections option. Now, some items can be updated, like their mailing address and their email address, or other contact information can be updated. And then other items must be updated. So if after the student submitted their FAFSA, there were any changes to their dependency status, that is going to make a huge difference in the aid that they are offered. So they will need to update that information. And then if the student is selected for verification, which we're going to talk a lot about in just a moment, they'll need to make corrections if there were any changes in the number of family members in the household, or if there were any changes in the number of people who are in college in the household. So they'll be prompted to do these required changes, but there are some changes that are merely optional, like updating a mailing address or an email address. And so one thing that used to be a part of the corrections process that has now been separated out to make it a whole lot easier for students is adding or updating the schools that a student lists on their FAFSA. So when a student lists all of the colleges where they'll be applying, they can then add or update those schools after they've submitted the FAFSA. So they no longer need to make a correction, the second option here. They can just go ahead and add or change the schools with this first option here. So moving on to verification. So say the student has checked, they've seen that their FAFSA is processed, they've reviewed their student aid report, and they notice that there is a note on the student aid report that they've been selected for verification. As many of you know, this process is just one that the school uses to essentially confirm the information that the student reported on the FAFSA. They want to make sure that the information is accurate and it does not in any way imply that the student is in trouble. And for verification, there's both federal verification and institutional verification. So as we'll see on the screen right here, on this student aid report under the processing results tab, this student has been selected for a review process called verification. So this is federal verification. Now, in addition, a student might be selected by their institution for verification. And there are some institutions that select 100% of their students for verification. So they'll either find out through their student aid report or by being contacted by their actual college. But all of the verification process will take place with the college where the student intends to enroll. So like I mentioned, the financial aid office of the college where the student's been admitted might contact the student. And that's because the verification process will vary by school. And each school will have a different way for students to submit additional documentation that ultimately supports the original information the student put on their FAFSA. And it's extremely important for students to respond quickly to any requests for documentation because the student's financial aid offer really depends on this information. So they're not going to have a final reflection of the offer they're getting from their school until they've completed the verification process. So I have a couple examples here just so you can see. So this is from the University of North Alabama. And as you can see, they post on their Office of Student Financial Aid webpage all of the 2023-24 verification forms. So if they've contacted the student saying, hey, we need you to complete this, they're likely linking them to this page where the student then clicks the worksheet that applies to them, fills it out, and submits it. Similarly, the University of Alabama has on their student financial aid page all of the 2023-2024 verification information. So it gives a little bit more detail about what this process looks like, how the student can complete the steps in their MyBama account. So each school is going to have a process specific to their institution. And it's important that students are monitoring both their email and also their online account to see what next steps they have with their school. Now, with verification, the US Department of Education has recognized that this process is generally a burden to students. And because of that, they've really aimed to reduce the instances and the reasons for verifying FAFSA information. So where it used to be around 30% or so of students might be selected for verification, it now should be a little bit less than 20% of students who are being selected. So hopefully you're not seeing this come up too much, but if you are, just know that you can guide students, and like y'all mentioned in your poll responses, refer them directly to the financial aid office of the college where they might be enrolling. So we've essentially seen that our application's been processed. We've reviewed our student aid report, made any corrections that are necessary, and then provided any verification information that's been asked of us. Now we get to the point where we've submitted all the information that we've needed to as a student, and so we should be receiving our aid offers. And generally, each college that accepts the student will send a financial aid offer. Now, some colleges send the offer in the mail, while others will post the offer online to the student portal accounts. Again, be sure to recommend to your students that they check their account frequently. And then each school has a different schedule for offering and paying out financial aid. So I know that this can be a bit anxiety inducing for students. Say they've already applied to all of the colleges that they're interested in. They've received admissions offers from these institutions, and now they're kind of playing the waiting game for financial aid packages. Tell them not to fret. It definitely depends on each institution when they'll be hearing back with an aid offer. And then when we roll around to their first semester of college, each institution will pay out aid at a different time. So if the student's interested in finding out these specific dates, they can always contact the financial aid office of the college. And then when the student finally decides which school they want to attend, they'll need to accept or decline each type of aid that's being offered to them by the college. So just to address a few concerns when a student initially receives their aid offer. So what if the financial situation of the student and their family has changed significantly, whether due to financial hardships or unemployment? So we know when a student submits their FAFSA, they are submitting their 2021 tax information. And that 2021 tax information might not fully reflect their current financial situation. Because of that, the student should communicate this to the financial aid office of the school. And we really recommend doing that immediately after they are submitting or completing their FAFSA and before they are even receiving an offer from the school. So if they know, our taxes reflected that both of my parents were employed, and now one of them is unemployed, the student can go ahead and reach out to the financial aid office of their college and tell them this information so that the college has a picture of the student's actual financial situation when they are extending an offer. Now, say the student does that, but then the financial aid offer they receive from the college still doesn't reflect their financial need. Now, they can do what is called an appeal directly to the college, and they'll have to supply documentation. But the college can then take that documentation and use what's called professional judgment to make adjustments to the information on the FAFSA. Ultimately, these adjustments can impact a student's EFC and then their grant eligibility. And so we have linked here some appeal templates that are provided by Swift Student. So just know that that's an option. Really, what we recommend to students is that they're having conversations with the financial aid office so that the office knows their situation. And then the office might recommend certain next steps for the student to officially document all of that, all of the changes they might have experienced. But just know there are appeal templates available to the student. So when the student gets their aid offer, it might not include every detail that they'll need in order to make an informed financial decision about their next steps. The main items, though, that the student should understand rather thoroughly are the overall cost of attendance, and then the total aid offered. And an offer or a package that the student receives might be showing all of this on a semester basis or on an annual basis. So when we talk about comparing aid offers, we want to make sure that we are comparing a semester basis to a semester basis or an annual basis to an annual basis. So just be aware of how the offer is actually framing all of this. So to break down those two components that I mentioned, overall cost of attendance will include things like tuition and fees, food and housing, textbooks and supplies, lab and course fees, transportation, health and medical care, and then personal or miscellaneous living expenses. Now, technically, every offer should include standard information, but of course, you'll probably see this formatted very differently just depending on institution. So the U.S. Department of Education has made a great effort to ensure that institutions aren't misleading students about the overall cost of attendance. Granted, I'm not sure how well this is actually working in practice, but really each institution should be providing a thorough cost of attendance that a student can analyze and compare to other institutions. And then the second item is the total aid offered. And we're going to break this down into 3 different categories. So the first is gift aid. Gift aid does not need to be repaid. So this includes things like scholarships and grants. Then we have aid that must be worked for. So these are work study job opportunities that the student can accept. Lastly, we have aid that must be repaid with interest, so loans. All of that makes up the total aid offered to the student by the institution. And so when we're looking at our aid offers and we're comparing them across institutions, one way to compare offers is to calculate the net cost. You might also see this referred to as the net price. And the net cost equals the school's cost of attendance minus the gift aid. So here we're only subtracting the gift aid, even though the total aid offered is comprised of 3 different types of aid. And we're only subtracting out the gift aid to get the net cost, because this tells you how much a student has left to pay out of pocket through student loans or through other means. And so institutions might actually include this net cost on the aid offer that they extend to students. But institutions might also have what's called a net cost or net price calculator posted on their financial aid webpage. So there are a few important considerations that I want to pull out and highlight when you're comparing schools. So we think about the 2 different items, the overall cost of attendance and the total aid offered. When we're thinking about the overall cost of attendance, we want to ask questions like, how do living expenses and indirect costs vary at each school? So there are direct costs, things like tuition and fees, and then there are a bunch of indirect costs that the students will definitely have, but aren't necessarily associated with their institution. They might be more associated with things like the geography of where the college is located. So when asking this question, we might think about what's the cost of living around this school. And so if we're looking at apartment rent and we're comparing rent in Montgomery, Alabama to New York City, New York, that's going to be very different for those 2 institutions that a student might be considering. So when we're thinking about the overall cost of attendance, we want to factor in how much does it cost to live in the place where the college is located. We also want to ask what assumptions are made on my aid offer. So the letter that the student receives might provide costs based on full-time enrollment. So what does that look like if I'm only intending to be enrolled part-time? And then what will be the total cost to complete the program? So when we're receiving aid offers, we might be seeing an annual estimate. But if I'm intending to be in school for 4 or 5 years, what would that look like for me to complete the entire program? So I want to multiply the annual cost by the expected number of years in school. That gives me a better picture of what my long-term cost is going to be. Now, here are a few considerations when comparing total aid offered. So remember, there are 3 different types of aid, one of which is gift aid. And gift aid includes grants and scholarships. So when we think about grants and scholarships, we want to ask, can the grants and scholarships be renewed each year? Are there certain criteria that a student must meet to maintain that aid? So is there a GPA requirement for them to keep their grant? Is there a credit number that they have to complete to maintain their scholarship. It's also important to consider that the offer the student receives from their college probably isn't reflecting any private scholarships that a student might have won. So say they've received a private scholarship from a local organization. That won't be reflected on their aid offer, but they should probably include it when they are comparing overall schools. And then it's important, especially when comparing schools, to understand if this aid offer from their private scholarship is going to reduce the amount of aid offered by their college. So this is what's known as aid displacement. So if you're not familiar, some colleges might ask the student whether or not they're receiving any other kind of aid outside of the aid that the actual college is offering. And then if a student reports that, yes, I have received a private scholarship, the college might then say, okay, well, then we're reducing the amount of aid that we're going to give you. It's a really unfortunate situation that a lot of people are advocating against, that colleges do this aid displacement, but it's just important for students to know that this could happen should they be receiving any private scholarships. And then more considerations for total aid offered. So we just talked about gift aid. Now we're talking about aid that can be earned. So for work study opportunities, how many hours can or must a student work if they accept a work study job? Will it be a manageable load if they're working part-time and taking classes? Will it be enough income for them to feel like they really are able to cover their college expenses? And then our last type of aid that has to be repaid with interest, are our loans. So we want to ask, what are the terms and conditions of any loans that were being offered? So we talked about considerations for overall cost of attendance, considerations for the total aid offered, and then there are a few considerations when comparing the balance due to the school. So what we actually have left over to pay. A few things we might want to ask when we're thinking about where to go to school is, does the school offer a payment plan? If they do, are there any fees or interest charges associated with the payment plan options? So we're going to take a look at a sample. So this is directly from the US Department of Education. And this is what they strongly recommend aid offers look like. Again, what actually happens in practice. I'm sure you'll see from your students if they're bringing in any examples, but essentially this aid offer is showing the total cost of attendance, and it is really helpful because it breaks it down by on-campus residents and off-campus. So you have your total estimated cost of attendance, and it's showing it per year. Then you have the EFC, or the expected family contribution, and this is based on the FAFSA. And so they're showing that per year. And then from the cost of attendance, we are subtracting out our gift aid, meaning no repayment is necessary. So it's showing all of the scholarships being offered, all of the grants being offered. It's also showing VA benefits. And then when we take the gift aid and subtract it from total estimated cost of attendance, we're getting the net price to us. So essentially, it's showing what we have left to pay after we account for this aid that doesn't have to be paid back. So that's the net price to us. After that, we're seeing aid that will have to be paid back or will have to be worked for. So our loan options and our work study options. And then this offer has a glossary. Now, some schools will send an electronic offer, and that electronic offer will link to a guide or a glossary where students can learn more about what each item means. So I find this might be especially helpful when thinking about loans, because loan names can often be confusing to students, especially when they're thinking about types of loans like Parent Plus loans and things like that, direct subsidized and direct unsubsidized loans. So just a good reference point for students to further understand what they're seeing on the first page. Here's another example of breaking down an award letter. So they have each item here broken out and described in detail. Like I mentioned, this one's kind of reverse of what we just saw, but it shows the financial aid offered before the estimated cost of attendance. And then when they subtract the financial aid from the cost of attendance, they're getting the total estimated balance. And then this award letter is showing that there are different payment options. So they can do 10 payments per year or 12 payments per year. So the student can see what that would look like with these payment plans. So when students have reviewed their aid offers from their schools, they're making these comparisons, and they've made the comparisons to ultimately decide which institution is best for them. At that point, they're going to have to decide what aid they're going to accept from that institution. So generally, it is best to accept aid in the following order. Obviously, you want to start with free money, so scholarships and grants. Then you want to accept earned money, so work, study, job. And lastly, borrowed money, so federal student loans. Now, if the student accepts an offer, the financial aid office at the school will explain exactly how and when that aid will actually be paid out. And it's important for students to know that they do not need to accept every offer. They certainly can, but they don't need to. And they might also have an option to partially accept an offer. So the college will also tell the student whether they need to fill out any more paperwork or meet other requirements. So if a student's receiving a federal student loan for the first time, then they should expect to sign a promissory note or possibly go through entrance counseling. So again, as we've been constantly recommended, it's important that the students stay up to date with what their school is giving them in terms of follow-up tasks, and just be in touch with the school's financial aid office to understand the actual process of receiving aid. So there are multiple steps, and the student should stay aware of that. Now, if a student has to accept loans, they want to ideally accept the loans with the most favorable terms and conditions. And usually that is going to mean choosing federal student loans, because those are going to have the lowest interest rates. If a student's considering another type of loan, they should definitely learn about the difference between that loan and federal loans. Interest rates could be quite different, terms and conditions could be quite different. And then again, students should only borrow what they actually need. So I'm gonna open it up to questions. See, one question: how did outside scholarships get applied? And can they be used to offset EFC of a family? So tell me if I'm misinterpreting your question. Outside scholarships, the student can apply for through a number of means. Like they might be able to connect with a local organization, find a scholarship opportunity through a national database. And then, like I mentioned, some colleges will ask the student if they're receiving any kind of outside aid. And if they are, they might engage in this terrible process called aid displacement, where they take that private scholarship that the student is receiving, and then they reduce the amount of aid that they're offering. So say they've offered the student a $5,000 scholarship, but then they find out the student got a $2,000 scholarship from an outside organization. They might reduce the $5,000 scholarship to $3,000 to account for this outside aid that the student is getting. And so that wouldn't necessarily impact, I'm actually not sure if it would impact EFC or the just total aid offered. But it could impact the amount that the student receives from the college. So I'm not sure exactly how the college accounts for the outside aid. I think you're asking whether or not the college is going to change the student's EFC or just directly change the aid that's offered. That I'm not sure of how they do that, but they could just overall the impact of it would be that the students' aid offered from the college would be lowered because of the outside aid that they're receiving. Let me know if I did not answer that question. I don't know the exact mechanism the college uses, other than that the direct impact is that the student would be receiving less aid from the college because of the private aid they're receiving. Now, there are some states that actually have such great advocates who've been pushing for aid displacement as a practice to end, that their state has enacted legislation to make sure that aid displacement is non-existent. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Alabama, but some states have made a lot of progress in that regard. It is unfortunate for a student to receive an aid offer and then ultimately have it reduced because they're accomplished enough to receive a merit-based scholarship, or they have such great need that they're receiving a private need-based scholarship. It is a very unfortunate practice. I know I gave a lot of information, so I'm going to link you to some resources, both in the slides that we'll be sending out in our follow-up email, but then also directly in the email. So FAFSA.gov has a great webpage all about accepting aid. And then the Federal Student Aid Toolkit has a really great article that parents and families can read about accepting aid. And then we always recommend our great friends at Get Schooled because they really put things into family-friendly language. So they have an aid offer article and a video that you can send to your families. And then I have linked here the two different items that I showed on our slides, that sample award letter that is from the US Department of Education, and then also a website about net price calculators and how students can use those to make comparisons across institutions. As always, we have our FAFSA walkthrough video. So if you have students who are still not through the application yet, they haven't even gotten to the submit button, then definitely feel free to send them a link to our walkthrough video. And then once they have clicked submit, we're always happy to assist them with any post-submission next steps that they might have. So I'm going to launch a quick survey, and while we're doing the survey, feel free to ask any questions that are lingering. All right, most of y'all have answered that, so I'll give it about 15 more seconds to finish off these poll questions, and then we have just a few slides after this. So in order to claim your professional development credit, you'll go to the PowerSchool website, and you'll enter in course number 295839 and section number 466891. Please remember to complete this process in the next 24 hours if possible. I think the State Department gives about a 2-day window for you to log into this web page and then enter in the course and section number. Like I mentioned, we have some upcoming events next week on Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. We're going to host this session, but specifically for students and families. So we would love it if you could promote this directly to your school and your community so that students and families know they can log on to Zoom, learn more about the post-submission steps that they have related to financial aid, and we would be happy to answer any of their questions during that. And then the next day, we're going to have another session of FAFSA office hours that will be from 10 to 11 a.m. So this is specifically for educators and for community-based organizations to log in, come and go as they please, ask any questions they have around the FAFSA, and really utilize the time however they wish. So if you have specific FAFSA questions, we definitely recommend that you come with those. And then lastly, we want to promote that on April 11th, we will have our virtual spring conference. So this is the Alabama College Attainment Network. If you'd like to learn more, we have that linked in our slides. And so we'll be sending the slides out shortly after this webinar. See a couple questions in the chat. So looking at PD again, here's the PD information. This is always included in the follow-up email as well. So you'll find the course and section number there. And then the events that we're having upcoming, so the student and family session, and then the educator FAFSA office hours, those will be available on our events webpage, but I'll also make sure to include some information about it in the email. Hopefully that answered your questions. As always, you and your students can contact us through our help desk. So you can text or call us at 334-316-6155. And then we hope you'll stay connected in other ways. So you can also email us, algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. I really appreciate you all being here today for asking questions. Hopefully I answered them all. If not, feel free to get in touch with us through our help desk or through email so that we can follow up with you. But we really appreciate how you support all of your students through this process. I know they're navigating a lot as they're deciding their next steps, especially as it relates to how to pay for college. So thank you so much for your time, and we will be seeing you soon.